Now, so Martin is going to present the work of Roberto Bartow, the metaphoric sequence, the visual of symbol career of meaning in contemporary experimental Spanish comics. Thank you very much, Martin. I guess you have your 5 minutes from right now.
Okay, so I'm going to share the screen again, if possible. Okay, no problem. Because I think it's very important to show images in this summary of Dr. Bartual's work. It's a piece, it's a work that it's quite, it's very interesting in my opinion, because it tries to explain what's happening in the gutter between the panels, and in that alchemy that Scott McCloud referred to in his Understanding Comics essay. But Dr. Bartual tries to explain that some of the processes that take place in between can be explained through the concepts of metonymy and metaphor. The first example that he mentions is that of the metonymic sequence, of the most simple of these processes, which is when a certain action is represented by a series of signs that are actually in that world, no? So we have Captain Haddock going up the gangway. We don't see him falling, but we see the result through those visual cues that could be the band-aids and the first aid box that Tintin or Tantan is holding on his hands, in his hands. The second type of sequence that he analyzes is that of the metaphoric sequence. Okay, the difference between the previous one and this one would be that there is some sort of semantic incompatibility. So here we have a comic strip in which the action of the punch is not shown, and instead of that they show us an image that doesn't belong to that context, but which shares certain semantic elements, which could be like the power of the atomic blast, the impact, but obviously there's many other, there's a lot of content that is not compatible with the context in which the characters are in. Then Dr. Bartual goes to focus in more contemporary Spanish and experimental Spanish comics, like that of Marta Alteris Joselito, which, for example, represents the the mental impact of bad thoughts by showing these people hammering the head of the main character in the comic. Then he finds another very good example in that webcomic in which he represents also the emotions that the character is going through by altering the color of the background and showing a superimposed image of a heart. I'm simplifying a lot what Dr. Bartual explains, but basically I think I have to be quick, no? So then he goes on to explain the difference between what would be a standard metaphor, such as the one we have in the sentence "Man is wolf" by Thomas Hobbes, with a suppletive metaphor, which is what we have seen in those comics, in which basically the source, the target is replaced completely by the source, like in this sentence, like in this verse by Lorca, which he says, "Her parchment moon," referring to the tambourine that's held by a girl. Then he also lists some other examples of suppletive metaphors, which could be the onomatopoeias or the stars that we so frequently see in comics, no? Very commonly accepted, a very commonly accepted coding, no? These suppletive metaphors often also can appear as a sequence. He refers to an example that he borrows from Neil Cohn, from this comic from Deadpool from Marvel Comics, and then he shows a less obvious example from a contemporary Spanish comic in which the main character is turned into a frog, and then he goes through the mental process of thinking what he knows about the frog. So he remembers like the frog he dissected when he was in high school, and then he thinks about fairy tales, but then the fairy tales of the prince and that turns into a frog gets confused with the story of Snow White. So basically this would be also a suppletive sequence. Then he moves on to a more complex type of metaphor, which is what he called a diegetic metaphorical transition, where also basically it's not non-linear. Yes, it's not a comic strip. Well, basically he moves on to explain more and more elaborated and complex types of metaphorical transitions and sequences that he will probably be able to explain better than me, until he reaches like one of the most well, a very extreme example of abstraction. So in his conclusion, he proposes a classification of these types of transition based on one hand on the level of organization of the sources, then on the level of abstraction of the sources, and then on the diegetic, I don't know how to pronounce it, nature of the sources. So that's my summary. And then, well, basically, I just have to explain, just have to tell that I really found very interesting his work. And then I would like also to ask him a question based on the conclusion, because he refers to the limitations of linguistics to analyze the language of comics, because the language of comics is not as linear as that of written texts or oral language. I would like him to elaborate a little bit more on that difference, and that's basically what I have to say.
Thank you, Martin. Roberto, your 5 minutes.
Okay, I want to answer to Martin's question, because what I have tried to do in this paper is to show how when metaphor has been studied in comics, it has been studied basically from the linguistics point of view. And when linguistics study metaphor in language, metaphor is considered basically for either an image that it is in substitution of another image, or two images that are compared together. But both mechanisms are basically linear, because they involve two things and with a linear relation between them two. Some of the images that Martin has shown at the beginning are basically the visual equivalent of these kind of metaphors. Like, for example, all these images that he has included, Mortadelo y Filemón, which are images that you have chosen. And I think that if you can show them again, because I think that these images are much better. It's much easier to explain what I mean with these images that you have chosen. The guy who is insulting Mortadelo y Filemón, instead of showing the real insult, which is you are pigs, sois unos cerdos, there's an image of two pigs. So this is basically a visual translation of a linguistic metaphor. I mean, The image is there in order to show some moral qualities that are absent from the message. This metaphor is always like trying to show the invisible without really saying what you mean. You choose an image from another semantic field. So that's how metaphor works on a linguistic level. But what this is the approach that this person Neil Cohn has used to study metaphor in comics. Like, for example, with this image, these are metaphors, images that are included in order not to show the sexual act. In fact, what happens with this kind of metaphors is that the images tend to be very, how could I put it? The images tend to be used in a very arbitrary way. The metaphor becomes fossilized in the sense that, well, you can see these typical cliché examples of metaphors of sexual intercourse, like, for example, the rocket, or, for example, the train entering the tunnel, which are actually images that are borrowed from the train from North by Northwest, the film by Alfred Hitchcock, and the rocket from this porn movie, Deep Throat. So it's basically using images in a very conventional way, using images as words. But there are some other kind of metaphors in comics that work in a very different way, not really. You can show the next image, maybe the next one. Yeah. In comics, something different than this can happen, because when comic uses an image, this image can be, all the images that we have seen before are images that come from outside the fictional world. But for example, in this comic, there's an example of a metaphor that is built with an image that really exists within the fictional world. It's a diegetic image, the image of the sun. I was going to propose something, because actually this presentation, this article that I have written, actually works better with your collaboration. Because what I like is to show you images, sequences, and tell me what you see here, so that I can show you my points. So maybe we can do this? Yes? I'm only going to say a few words to give some context for this comic. This is from a comic called Primavera para Madrid, which was Premio Nacional del Cómic some years ago, 2 years ago. I think you, Alvaro, wrote the prologue, yes? Yes. Yeah, okay. These are the first few pages, and this is set in Madrid. This is a very iconic image of in Madrid, actually very near the place where I live. These 4 towers were built some years ago as well, after a process of real estate corruption. This comic is about corruption in Spain, and these towers in Madrid are owned by a real estate company, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and CAMSA, which is a petrol company, and there's a big hotel too. So you have all the powers there. You have consulting companies, you have petrol, you have real estate. The ground where these towers were built were owned by Real Madrid. So you have football there. You have everything that can be corrupted in Spain. So this is an image of the sun, of the sunset, because it's a place where the sun sets. And there is a sequence that begins in that tower, which actually has a chapel in the last floor. And well, there's the priest giving mass at the chapel. Do you want to comment on this, or what do you think? There is a big metaphor going on here, but I think that it is very expressed in a very subtle way.
I think you also have to mention that the ink is golden. No? That's something that you mentioned in your work, like the ink that they used to print the drawings was golden.
Yeah. The comic is printed in golden ink. No, in golden paper. Yeah.
And golden paper.
That's black ink. Yeah, black ink, golden paper. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I cannot hear.
The Eucharist, the body of Christ, right? The Son that it keeps moving and becomes something that we all share and we eat in the Mass, right? So that's the metaphor of those, that capitalist, I don't know, society that we all sharing and we all are, in communion with. I don't know.
Actually, the different positions of the sun in the page make you think that it is sunset.
Right.
Did you have the feeling that it was sunset and not sunrise when you read this?
I make a comment. The first one, I don't know why, but I have the impression of Stonehenge.
Yeah, of course.
And that's the evolution of humanity and the values.
Yeah. It's a little bit like this ellipsis in 2001, like Kubrick, where
the monoliths.
Yeah, the bone goes up and then it turns into a ship. So this is like Stonehenge turning into a modern day monument to power, and the sun, which is actually a god. I don't know, any more comments?
Yes. This is a symbol of a new religion, the new religion of corruption in Spain.
Yeah.
Stonehenge is a symbol of religion, and this is a symbol of a new cult, the religion of the corruption.
Yeah, that's it. And you comment as well, Roberto, that this tall building, that represent wealth and money and power, echoes as well other buildings being constructed by humanity throughout time, like the pyramids or other places that tend to reach, God, or tend to, get humanity closer to deities. So in this case, it seems like those new deities or gods are, well, money fundamentally. But the sun itself, because it turns into the body of Christ, I mean, the sun, because it's placed in that place, is that what, along with the other images of the tall building, is that represents in a way all that is corrupt and rotten, and it's a dark spot.
Yeah.
So, and the fact that it's then turned into the body of Christ is even more poignant. So I don't know. I was reading it that way, but
because it's a black host. It's not white.
Yeah.
And because of course, since the pages are golden, the only ink that they could use to print was black. So yeah, that's another thing that I didn't foresee. Yeah, and of course there is the fact that the sun becomes the host creates a connection between these two things, these two symbols, saying that this new religion, money, is related to the old religion too. I mean that these people actually have the economic power, since they have a chapel up there in the tower. These people are actually very religious, as we know about people who hold power in Madrid or in Spain in general. So any other
There's another thing, so if I may.
Yeah.
There's a really wonderful comic as well by a Cuban artist, by Salomon, by by Chago, perdón. Chago, the comic is Salomon. And I used it in the front cover of my book. Not important that detail, but it's so important that I really like that one. And it's as well, not the sun, but the moon, but turns into a face. And the jester is at the bottom, and the jester has all these guirnaldas, I don't know the name for it.
Garlands, I think.
But they are lying down, but as soon as the moon is going into the vertical position where the jester is, all these go up as if you are being watched, as if you're being observed by the big brother. And then as they go down again. I love that because in the Cuba has other resonances. But again, it's using not the sun, but the moon. And depending on the position in the page, it creates effects. And it has, well, actually, that's the one, yeah. And it's as well using that moon that goes and connects, and the artist in a way is what is, you know.
Yeah, so the movement of the moon is creating some kind of connections with those garlands that you can interpret in many ways, I think. That was basically what I was trying to show with this example, in order to argue that in this case, metaphor doesn't work as in the other cases, because in the other cases you have like a very binary relation between the image and the target of that metaphor. I mean, a very binary relationship between the image and what the author wants to say. But here we have explained this page in many different ways. And I think that nobody's right, nobody's wrong, all interpretations are complementary. So probably the author didn't think, of course he thought about this because this metaphor is very purposeful, but probably he didn't think about all the possibilities. And in this case, it's much more difficult to talk about a metaphorical image and then a target, because the target is a little bit more ambiguous than in the rest of the cases. So what I was trying to argue with this article is that in comics, when you use diegetic images that have this capability of becoming symbols at the same time, things become more complex for metaphors. Talking about the moon, there is another example, the next sequence, which is much harder to interpret, maybe. So maybe we can do a little experiment with this now that we were talking about the moon and with Jorge's example. In order to give you context, this is a much more ambiguous comic by David Sanchez, which is an author that he draws his influence from the visions caused by psychedelic drugs. So the images that he uses are much more ambiguous and much more archetypal than the kind of images that we have seen before. And this is from his graphic novel Un Millón de Años. And basically the kind of stories that he writes and draws about are like David Lynch sequences, very oniric, very surrealistic sequences. In this one, there is a man, a father, who is out in the desert talking with his son, and maybe you don't see the dialogues there, but I can translate them for you. In the first page, they are talking about God, and the father is saying that God has no ears, God can't hear you, but he has a purpose. In the second image, the second page is just the moon, and they start talking about beetles and insects. And in the third page, there's some kind of bug or beetle that gets near the boy. And I haven't included the next page, but in the next page, the bug gets the leg of the boy and stays there like in the movie Alien. Like, yeah. So what do you think about the moon here?
One just
Yeah, I think
A
so.
of the personage?
I think so. I think so for a simple reason, because if you see the structure of the page, of the pages, it's the most striking thing about the page. Well, the first thing is why these three moons are repeated in different positions and why these people have one eye. So graphically, the author is creating a relation between the form of the moon and the fact that they only have one eye. But the thing here is that he's not very expressive about it. He creates a relation between these two elements, but he doesn't tell you what's this about. So there must be something about this.
I was thinking that also it's talking about the passage of time.
Yeah.
You know, and how it evolves in whatever, you know, images they have in their mind, and that's what I was first thought when I was looking at it. You know, like it's showing this passing of time and how this awareness of consciousness or altered state of consciousness changes with time. Just what I thought, you know.
One more thing, I was thinking about the importance of the fire and the shadows, whether it's the Plato's cave, and if you do not see anything else, only the shadows, so that's the reality for you, because there's also the shadow on the last place. So I just thought whether there is the relation with Plato's cave.
I hadn't thought about the fire, but you're right, because especially what you said about the fact that the fire is what they, the fire allows them to see.
To see, yeah.
So we have the eyes, we have the light, we have the moon, the act of seeing.
I don't know if because the moon has a symbology of hide. The hide things are hidden. Tarot also, and the central eye is the capability to see the third eye. We talked, no?
To see inside yourself, or to see the reality.
The other dimensions that are hide to the physical dimension. No?
Yes, but the moon in the tarot always means that things are not what they may seem. So, because the light of the moon is deceiving. So we have all these things, and
can I just have a quick intervention? Could it be a reference to Luciano Andalu, as in Buñuel's film?
To what?
Luciano Andalu.
El perro andaluz.
Yeah,
could and be. The eye.
Yeah, because the eye of the moon, I didn't thought about that.
I've not necessarily. I'm just thinking of it as in terms of the surreal escape and then the moon moving across the scene. It's the same cut.
It's the side. Actually, that cross cutting in the in Luciano Andalu made the same association between the moon and the eye. So, if you remember the dialogue that they are having. The Father and the Son, the things that they are saying about God, you will have the last piece of the puzzle. Yes, the Father and the Son, the Father was telling the Son, just please remember that God has no ears, but he has a purpose for you. He's talking about the senses of God.
The moon being the eye of God, watching down upon them.
Yeah, the eye of God watching down to them. That's exactly. I want to show, I don't know if you included the
5 minutes.
Yeah, that one, and we end with this. This is a page that comes later in the narrative. The kid is with the bag on the leg, as I told you, like an alien, and he's dying. And then the father is looking for help in the desert, and then this creature appears. And this is basically the conclusion of the story. And my question is, who's this? I mean, who's the rider? Oh, the deaf, or?
I thought, can I just say it was, I thought it was either fate or death.
Yeah, it's that. But why do you know? Why do you know that?
Death rides a pale horse and fate is blind.
It could be God too, because as we have been said, she has no ears, and the eye is up above. So he's constructing metaphors not by using this binary relation between a source and a target. He's just creating associations with things, and it's very difficult to make a linguistic translation of all these. I mean, it's much more difficult than in the first examples that I showed. So what I tried to argue with this is that comics is not really about suppletive mechanisms. It's not really about one image in substitution of another, but about creating relations among different images by what Thierry Gorenstein called braiding, the translation of English. In French is tressage, I think, which is exactly what David does here. I'm sure if you ask David about this, he is going to tell you, no, I just had a vision and drawn this. He's very, when you ask him about the meaning of his comics, he just tells you that just inspired by his experience, and he doesn't try to get a meaning out of these. But you discuss the pages among friends, and you always get the same messages. The pages start pointing to the same things. So maybe there's something there apart from the purpose of the author. I mean, metaphor is something that has a life of itself.
Wow, I'm sorry I have to cut this suggestive session. And I guess everybody is thinking, oh, I should say this and this and this, but sorry, I have to cut it. But we're going to stay with Roberto, that's going to present. Now we have to work for the others. Roberto is going to present the work by Eva van de Wille and Joe Sutcliffe, Comics for Girls.
I had some of the images that they used on their text. Okay. Yep, I can show them. So, okay, going to
click it and then you can be there, Roberto, or you can be here, whatever you want. I mean, it's a key, it's a movable keyboard, so you can operate it from there.
So, yeah.
Images, where you want. Yeah.
Okay.
From here.
Okay. So, sorry for the delay. Eva van de Wiele and Joe Sutcliffe Sanders wrote a marvelous article about girls in comics. Well, it's actually comics for girls. They have, what they have done is to study, how would we call it, the paratexts that were included in a Spanish magazine, Spanish comics magazine for girls called Bebe, which was the female counterpart of a very famous comic magazine, Tebeo, which is actually the word that we use to call comics. We still call them Tebeos. That was very popular. So what they have studied are not really the comics themselves, but the paratexts, which are these, for example, when the comics included cutout dolls, when they included like games, when they included, for example, portraits of famous actresses as role models for girls. And they have been studying these paratexts using a methodology that is based on two authors, Robin Bernstein and Robin Wigmans. The first one, Robin Bernstein, they borrow from them the concept of script or scripting. That's What they mean with this is that these magazines, as cultural objects, tell the readers in a certain way how to interact with the object, especially when you have this kind of paratexts that have instructions to make games, instructions to play with the dolls, and all these kind of things. And in the way they use the script, I mean, the script can be the reader can follow the script literally, or they can, there's always a room for improvisation or transgression. And one of the things that they underline very much is that we can't know what the kids really did with these texts, with these magazines, because we don't have too many sources like diaries and biographies, personal confessions. But we can actually, as we decodify the script or reveal the script, because it is included in these magazines. And they also use two other terms, two other theoretical terms. One of them is chaperoning. This term was created by Robin Wigman. And chaperoning means that, especially books for children, comics for children, there is always, when readers are very young, there is always an adult reader that is helping in a certain way. Like, for example, asking questions to the young reader, like, for example, you have this image and this other image, how they combine, what happens, what do you think that happens next, all these kind of things that help the reading. And this is important too, because in some of these games, in some of these paratexts or parallel games, it is important the presence of an adult person that is going in a certain way to teach the girl how to do this. And the most important thing is what they are taught to do. Okay. Like, there are many examples. I don't know if I will have time to show them, all of them, but this is actually one from Tebeo, which is the magazine for boys. And this is a cross-gender game. I mean, it's both for boys and girls, in which the kids are instructed to build some airplanes with a piece of cork and some paper, and then to use some tokens or coins in order to, well, like bombs, something like that, just like a war game. This is the kind of game that we find in boys' magazines, but on the other hand, the games that you will find in girls' magazines are quite different, because they are actually not games. And how do you, yeah? Where is the, I don't see. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Actually, one of the things that they state is that they are actually not games. They are not ludus. They are, oh, yeah. No, they are not paideia. They are ludus. Yeah. They are not, I mean,
30 seconds.
Yeah, they are entertaining things, but the purpose is some other. This is a pattern to make a braiding with to build a pocket, to put your needle and your thimble and your thread. And the purpose here was to teach the girls the different kind of stitches that they could use. I actually found the terms in English. They are trying to teach punto de cadeneta, which is lock stitch, and punto de vástago, which is shank stitch. And well, it's more instructional than any other thing, not really playful. There are many more examples, but I guess that I don't have a question for you because you expressed yourself so clearly in this article. But maybe it's interesting if you show us the rest of the examples, because I could only have the opportunity to talk about the games.
Thank you very much, Roberto. So maybe Eva and Joe, maybe you would like to highlight some points or.
Thank you very much for that reading. I think you've summarized this really well. So this really comes from Eva discovering a really rich trove of information for us to examine. And then the two of us talking about how to collaborate on it, and discovering that we had some methodological and theoretical interests in common. So much of what we've written here was about how to approach this kind of text. One of the main points that we kept referring to in the piece that we wrote was that it's an inferential methodology. Yeah, that we can't make very solid claims about what did happen, but we can make educated inferences about how the text asked the girls to interact with the text. So it's it feels a bit like walking a tightrope, right? Because we don't have something very solid beneath us that we can build an argument on. It's an awful lot of inference. The other thing I'll say about that is that this too is kind of like walking a tightrope, because we don't want to fall too far one way or the other. We want to be watching for nuance. We're trying really hard to watch for surprises in the evidence. There is a large, consistent, predictable story here, which Roberto has summed up very well, that boys are given games and opportunities to play and extemporize and to work within and slightly beyond borders. And girls are given very strict guidelines and told to follow them with very little extemporization. That's the large, consistent, and not at all surprising story, right? And we want to make sure that we're watching for places where that story gets more complicated also. So are there ways to look at the work that girls are being given as, for lack of a better word, empowering? Or are there places where there is room for play, but it shows up in a way that it would not for the boys? So we're trying very hard to look for where the surprises are, where the nuance is, as well as telling the honest story, which is exactly what you would expect. Boys get a certain story, girls get a different one, and they break down along fairly predictable lines. Eva?
Yes, and for me that was the most difficult part also of my PhD on TBO, just trying to find those complexities within the magazines and what we can learn from them. And maybe, Roberto, I don't know if you go to another figure, is there 5 in the... Cinco, ahí no está. Ay. Es una pena. 6, what is it? Oh no, 6 is a bit more. Well, maybe we can look at 6. One of the other things that you'd expect, and I'll just say, I'll talk, como 2 debajo. Ah, no, sí, es el último quizás. Porque veo thumbnail, figure 4. Uy. Ah, el 5, ¿veis? 5, quizá más abajo. No, más abajo. Ese es 4. ¿Dónde está 5? Ya, en 5 no está. Bueno, ya, qué pena. Ah, no, sí, quizá podríamos abrir el 4 porque también está en el 4. Okay, so looking for those complexities or nuances, for example, I do apologize for the very obvious blackface cartoon in the middle, for which we didn't warn our public. But what I would like to point out is to the right, you see Susanna Langland. I didn't know about this woman, but she was an early 20th century sports talent. And if you look her name up on the internet, you find photographs almost exactly like the move she's in here. And well, I was talking to Joe about this. How can we interpret the presence of either female sports talents, sports persons, or actresses, which is in other cases? And I think I also talked about this with Mel Gibson, who is here in a virtual way. And she sent me a very nice paper of hers. Well, all her papers are nice, but this one is particularly relevant for this research of ours. It's a paper from 2018, Who's the Girl with the Kissing Lips, if I can abbreviate it like that. And Mel Gibson actually uses a very interesting notion of resonant images, and the way resonant images shift, showing shifts in our society, societal changes. And yeah, the fact that a blackface cartoon, the typical recetario, no prescriptions for girls how to, well, I think recetario is to like do home chores, like cleaning and stuff like that. But there's also de mi carne, was about cooking. So how those very domestic bedroom culture is also an interesting notion of girls collides with then women aspiring to an own career and to a job. I think can show how complex these magazines are, how these magazines are trying to cater to different girlhoods or manifestations of girlhood. And also in the first figure that Roberto showed, I think it was the 2, or if I just can, the importance always of the paratexts of comics. I didn't realize when I started studying comics. I think, yes, it's really interesting. To do the bolsillo de punto de bordado, you really have to read the instructions carefully, which means that you're a very good reader, and you really have to be dexter. And then below, there is a comic in which Bebe and Tebeo, so the two mascots, let's say, of the two magazines are interacting. And yeah, I don't remember, Tebeo ha construido una, de monigotes, bailarines. So it's really interesting. The constructivity comes from the boy, not the girl. The girl is just a passive admirer of the. So that's also, it's always interesting to see the context of, well, the paratext and the comic. I find interesting. I don't know if just blah blah. I hope that. And yeah, I think in general, what we would like to get from this session is that, well, I would really much like to do this kind of research in a postdoc, and I have to write a very convincing research proposal to do so. So any tips or feedback is extremely welcome.
Thank you, Eva. So you heard, it's a help, a big help. Okay, I'm going to begin because I have to. No, so I'm going to begin, even if I know it's not the point working on more adult magazines, because it's for comics, for children comics or so. But I guess they have all the ingredients of women's magazines.
Yes.
So it's kind of a preparation for what they will find in this kind of contradictory press when they ask you to be modern, but traditional, but not too much. So for instance, you have Susanna Lenglen here.
Yeah.
And then you have also this image that is showing that is the boy, the active one, constructing something for the girl. So it's kind of, you have to, but not too much, not too high. So it's in the 20s. There, I am going to share with you some bibliography. It's Mujeres de Papel by Juana Gallego. It's an old book from the 90s. It's about women's magazine. You're going to see both spaces, public and private. And I guess that can help you to understand the codes of this kind of press, even if it's for children, but it's the same formula that we are all eating. So that's my intervention. And then I'm going to share the word to someone else.
Can I follow up with your comment? Sorry. I really like that idea of actually this kind of instruction or ways of following things to do and tasks and so on as a preparation to read women's magazines. I think that's a really, really good idea. It's brilliant actually, because it really does prepare, right? It's like prepara el terreno hasta cierto punto, right? In the sense that these are things that you expect to find in your reading, and you're already accustomed, and you're already very familiar with the domestic space of, right? So even reading, even though it's literacy, is even a lot of these elements of modernity is still within the boundaries of the home, domesticity, and chores and so on. So I think that following that, and also image in that instruction part, is really important. One of the interesting things that you find, for example, how illustrations come into the literature of women, and I will probably talk a little bit about this tomorrow, is that, for example, in cookery books, when illustrations enter, is because mothers and daughters start living in separate households, and the instruction, it cannot be shown, so it has to be illustrated, and that's one of the earlier ways in which illustration enters this kind of writing. So I think that the image and the doing, right, in the terms of women's work, because that's what all this is, right? It might be a really interesting way of thinking about sort of the didactic nature of comics for girls, that is not about play, but it's about work, which is really unfair. But anyway.
First of all, congratulations. I think it's a very interesting research topic, and we have like a very interesting corpus to research. I just pointed out something that might be useful or not at all, just so I just go ahead and say it. But I think that on and on, it has to do with, I mean, in the context of the early 20th century, especially the 1920s, where it's a decade that is very special for women, but not just women, but the idea of what is feminine and what is not. Starting by the very basic stuff, just like the corset becoming outdated, and women's fashion being completely different from previous decades. One of the things that now you mentioned this idea of resonant image, and a very resonant image that I just it was the first thing I saw was Mary Pickford's drawing, and that reminded me of Avi Warburg's Pathos Formel, the idea of the nymph that he tracks through history. And I can't remember the name of a German female golf player from the 1920s. She was very famous, kind of a celebrity. But you can look at that in the panel number 77 from the Atlas Mendocino, the Avi Warburg. It's online, and it's very similar. And it reminded me of that. It's just a detail. Maybe it has nothing to do with your research, but at the same time, it's interesting that this kind of images shows up, because it has to do with this kind of figure of the feminine that at some point is challenging its constriction within representation. It always shows up as moving, and also that this means that movement is defining more her body, so there's a sexual dimension to it. But you might want to look into it if it's of any use to you. And then you talk about this real life stars, this idea of the how this is also the consolidation of the Hollywood star system, and it's very interesting. There are a few references from Latin America, but still might be useful on how this is a moment where women and men are changing their behavior in some way, or the way you behave, the way you dress, based on this interaction with Hollywood star system, and how that kind of subverts at some point what is feminine and what is masculine. Then I can give you the references later on. And there was also something you say something about flowers and how they show up. And I remember this this text, I think it's by Georgina Guzman. There was this late 19th century, early 20th century magazine, a kind of proto-feminist magazine called El Búcaro Americano. Búcaro was kind of a vase where you put the flowers, like these very big vases that were used in the 19th century. And it's interesting, the analysis of the image of the flower, because obviously it has to do with women, the female genitalia, but also the way of women being delicate, but at the same time, underneath that, also trying to interact more, to be more, had a more active participation in cultural and social life. So I can also pass you that text. And then I was thinking about maybe Sandra Sear's work on, I mean, this is in Argentina, early 20th century illustrated magazine for kids. It's not, of course, Spanish magazines, but there was a lot of contact with Spain, and many publishers, not to say most of them, were actually Spanish or were Spanish immigrants. So there might be, I mean, you might want to check that work. It's Spanish so far. I don't think it's been translated, but it might be useful too, just to compare to see how, you know, this, I think there's also this kind of reconfiguration of not just what men and women are, but also what children should be, obviously. So it's all interconnected at some point. And it's, I mean, it's, on the one hand, you have that, and also like this consolidation of cultural, popular culture on a global scale, thanks to movies, but also magazines. So I'm sorry, Chuck, if I'm just mumbling stuff incoherently, but you know, those were some of the ideas that your presentation triggered me, and I think it's a very promising research.
Something that you said, and
Thank you.
When you were talking, and then when he mentioned the flowers and everything, I was thinking that in Latin American avant-gardes, if you read, for example, early works by Alfonsina Storni or Delmira Agustini, or you can see that, for example, the way in which they talk about the female body and sexuality and all that is through floral metaphors. Everything is flowers, roses, roses, roses in my finger, they grow up. Or my husband is in the nest, and oh, my love is in the trees and all that. So you see definitely how the metaphors that these women writers were using were related to flowers and fruits and trees and all that. If you compare that, for example, with Oliverio Girondo, I don't give a damn if women are this or that or whatever, you see definitely a complete different language and talking about the same subjects, right? And it's almost when you read them, when you read Delmira, when you read Agustin, you see always floral metaphors, even when they are being daring. What they are talking about is about flowers and opening and closing and this and that, right? So when you compare that with writers, male writers in the avant-garde, you definitely see a completely change in language. So I don't know if it's useful or not, but it's what I was in my mind. I was comparing the different kind of treatments related to women and male roles, right? Because that's the other thing.
Just a very quick reaction to that. What would be super interesting for us if we want to thoroughly research this product is to know who did what work on these pages. So I would like to know if women artists were asked to do the floral decoration or the margins of, because none of that is existent in Tibio. There's a lot of insects, flowers, everything here, but we unfortunately don't know who did that work. While some of the comics artists were the same people. You also see it in Star.
Yeah, I also love the paper. Really, it's really interesting, and the topic is under researched. And rather than focusing on how throughout the dictatorship in Spain it was ideologizing women and girls, well, we know it happened before, but this is clear, evidence that it happened and how it happened. So it's very, very interesting. Although, as Joe was saying, it's navigating that tightrope of well, the concept of the scripting, I think, is great, and how the artist or the magazine is trying to put, certain guidelines on how to do this, and then, in a way, focusing, the reactions of the audience, male and female, in a certain particular way. It will be very difficult to prove what happened afterwards, but you can use inference for that, and that is really, really good enough. But I think the concept of scripting is really interesting because, on the one hand, it's very close to other concepts as well, using comics studies and how the artist, or in this case the magazine, is trying to guide the reading of this piece. And we know that Gorenstein uses braiding as, these repetitions that appear, and then the keen eye or the keen reader will be spotting that, and then he will be compensated by that, rewarded because he has to identify all these things, right? So in this case, it's a matter of how can you prove, the reader is acting accordingly, and then rewarded by that is very difficult, okay? But what I really like about this paper as well is that, and when it's related to Roberto's conceptual metaphors, is that there are instances in which this scripting is flawed. And then there was one example that you used, Roberto, and it's the example of the frog, and that relates to a fairy tale. But the fairy tale of Snow White has no frog. However, when that author is thinking about, or that character is thinking about frogs, he remembers things, and okay, this is Snow White, and the frog, but actually there's no frog in that fairy tale. So the script in there doesn't work. I mean, the artist or the author is guiding the reader on the wrong direction. Is guiding the reader on the wrong reading, or not the wrong reading, but a reading that doesn't correlate with what we know about fairy tales. So the scripting also can be complicated by things that actually really not wrong, but they are not accurate to reality or to the cultural repertoire that we have, in this case, fairy tales. So I think those things, I found it really interesting because there was a connection there. And yeah, I love the paper.
And maybe
just a quick comment. Yeah,
too fast, more questions.
Yeah. Just going to that question about you were interested in knowing who did this work. Have you looked at the Sección Femenina and people that are involved in that organization that will actually work in this kind of illustration? But because a lot of the images and the wording, it reminds me a lot of the Sección Femenina materials of that year. Anyway,
I was just thinking about what you've mentioned, Jorge, and perhaps what if it's on purpose that he speaks about Blancanieves and there is no frog. It's the same like if you have any fiction and they speak about July the 17th as a Sunday in 1892, and you'll find out that it was Monday. But does it change the message? I mean, if it's not the correctness in that aspect, but you are being directed to a certain narrative, to a certain outline, so that you know that it's a fairy tale. So that's the way you should think, not about any other layers. I don't know whether I'm clear what I want to say, that there are like, yeah, I'm misguiding you in certain ways, but how many readers in that quick reading realize, oh, but there's no frog. It's just, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I guess you have some answers or some kind of ways to look for. And then we're going to go to the third presentation by Eva van de Wiel and Joy Sotliff that are going to present the text by Rodri Sheldrake. It's Beginnings of Avant-Garde Approaches to Exploring Islamic Visual Print Media During Apertura. You have 5 minutes to do it.
Okay. Ava, are you able to click through? Okay, great. Yeah, good. Thank you very much. So this is our presentation of Rodri's wonderful paper. Go ahead to the next screen, please, Ava. Good. Okay, so as you know, this paper is about a very specific period in Spain, Spanish comics. Very specific cartoonist is what he does most of. And one of the things that we liked very much about this paper, we liked all of it, so you can relax, everything's cool. One of the things that we liked very much about this paper was that he gives us this image early on, and all of the ideas radiate out from this image. All of them then come back and touch on this image. So we're going to show you this image. We're actually going to do a dramatic performance of it now. And afterwards, we're going to ask you just to think for about 15 seconds about what you see here. As professional comics readers, what jumps out at you? So we'll do our reading now. Ava is the character on the left, I'm the one on the right. Me no comprende. Thank you. I do a great impression of someone who doesn't speak Spanish. Okay, so your task was just to look at this and see what jumps out at you, what sorts of things you see here that that seem especially interesting. We are going to skim through very quickly a few ideas that stood out to us especially, and then Ava has some questions we'll end with. So Ava, go on to the first point, please. So some key points. There's an idiosyncratic Spanish that's being used here. And this ties to, I may not say this word right, Islenic, all right. So Ilenic, this is one of his ideas that he's looking not at Spanish comics writ large, but specifically at this cartoonist from the Canary Islands. And that there is embedded in this a certain sense of a certain very specific location. Okay, the next one. You'll see that there's caricature here, especially in the character on the right. And caricature, as we know, lends itself to constructing an in-group and an out-group. This is one of his main points, is that there's that this cartoon creates a sense that those of us reading it are in the in-group, laughing at people who can be characterized, can be caricatured, and they're the out-group. Okay, the next one, Ava. If we look at the tourist, there's first of all a sense that this is a tourist, which implies a certain exoticization of the place being visited. Also, there's under the left arm there a camera, which also implies this. And that's not my observation, that's his. The next point we have is the local place's mixed relationship with the outside world. I'm giving this only a few seconds, but this is one of the richest, most complicated ideas he gets to. Archipelagic thinking. So when there's a group of islands, what that as a metaphor has to do for how to think. And it's important to realize that in this image and in the other comics he studies, there's a regional meaning, there's a sense of a national meaning, and there's a sense of a transnational meaning. So there is a sense here of regional, how we, those of us in the place where this cartoon is produced, feel about it. Also what it says about our relationship to the rest of Spain. Also what it says about our relationship and Spain's relationship to the rest of the world. And all of that is implicit here. Okay, the next one. He doesn't talk about the signature, which we'll say a little bit more about in a moment, but we wanted to bring this forward because this non-diegetic signature right there in the middle, which really does stand out, ties to his point about how there's the invention of a cartoonist persona. All right, the next one. And he spends a good bit of time unpacking how the authority figure is represented here, that this is that this borrows images that make it clear that this is a Franco era specific figure of authority. And there is a complicated relationship with him. In the next point here, there's this idea of heterogeneous satire. And what I'm taking from that is that it's satire that works in multiple directions, multiple ways simultaneously, so that there's a very complicated relationship between the viewer and this character and the authority it represents. I think that's my last one, so I've left some time for Eva to have some questions.
Maybe we could just go back to the cartoon that you've chosen, and indeed all of your brilliant ideas, we find them back in this cartoon. The structure of the paper is excellent. I wouldn't change a thing. We were interested just to get some more information about, I thought it was very interesting that you said, look at the flower on the hat of the tourist and the clownesque state that gives to the tourist. That was really nice. I was wondering whether you could say something more about, have you thought about the particular uniform of the Guardia? Can you say which one it was? Because in your paper, you say it can be Guardia Civil or...
Yeah, so as far as we know, in terms of the history of the Canaries, and there's a specific paper which has been written on this, which I can flag up if it's of anyone's interest, police history in the Canary Islands during the 20th century. But if not, I'll leave you be. Now, I did try to look into it. From what I can tell, he's likely Guardia Civil, on the basis that the Guardia Municipal, or what became the Policia Local, was dissolved following the war, and the Guardia Civil took over the majority of the administration of the islands. And importantly, that included a military governor, which is why I think we can infer this authority figure to possibly represent or stand in for local administration at the time, because of the lack of political figures really until 1962 with technocratic reforms. Really, practically speaking, most important figures would have been military and linked to the Guardia Civil. So I think he's Guardia Civil from what I could tell. Again, if there was some sort of local policing outfit that might have existed, that's also possible. This is the Canaries, where parallels exist all the time, and nothing is quite what it seems to say it is in X article, X thing, but as far as I can tell, he's Guardia Civil, yeah.
And to go back to the idea of the signature of the caricaturist persona, I thought that the position was extremely interesting, because we're in front of a opposition, binary opposition.
Yeah, so you've managed to preempt what is actually in the later part of this, which is that I then go on to look at Chaujois' piece. The record, the actual artist is called Eduardo Miyares Sal. He's the brother of this artist Manolo Miyares and quite a few of the sort of avant-gardists. So Chaujois was a creation of his. Linked to this series, which is called Un Isleño. Chaujois later goes on to become the editor of his own review, which is called El Conducto, which is printed alongside El Diario Las Palmas, I think. In essence, he is a fictional character. The thing about Chaujois is that what many people argue he stands in for is local wisdom. When he's depicted as this trope character, which we would call a mago, which in the Canaries is in essence a traditional local figure wearing a traditional local outfit. I think there's a picture of him actually in the image at the start. Chaujois is distinct from Eduardo Miyares Sal, who is this quite cosmopolitan figure. He ends up traveling the world with his brother in exhibiting around the world. He's distinct from the creation of Chaujois. I think there's a lot more I would go into and do go into later on around the notion of, especially Chaujois being constructed as this iconic figure, this almost mythic iconicity, which is used to stand in for all the local represents in the face of the forasteros who are coming to destroy us, while at the same time also directly subverting that narrative, which is what I sort of wanted to argue here, especially. Initially, when we look at this piece, in my view, you see a funny, probably English bloke walking around a Canarian town, and everyone goes, haha, funny English bloke. The deeper you look into it, the more you realize that really Chaujois here isn't digging holes at the funny English bloke. He's digging holes at the Guardia Civil. He's digging holes at local authority and the way that it enables a permissibility that forasteros had that its perceived locals don't. Chaujois being the local character, being the Malo, being the sort of voice of folk wisdom, almost in this mythicized way, is thus able to inscribe a certain resistance to authority, which, in my view, in this period, sort of 1950 to 1960, was very, very rare. And I think that's why it's quite an interesting piece to me in terms of how it does interplay. But yeah, I think especially in terms of the creation of Chaujois, he is a myth. He is an iconic character. He's completely non-existent, and more to the point, he's often very incongruous in the way that he behaves, or what he draws, or how he publicizes things, because he's simultaneously this very much outward-looking figure, very much interested in the world, and also this locally inward-looking look at me, I'm a backward Canarian. So it's quite an interesting interplay, which I think we'll find, and that's why it comes back round to the point on archeologic thinking and the notion of trying to think through different scales to deconstruct this. That's why the key notions that sort of fit in are that of relation and relation, relation with a capital R being the larger network of relation in which this is situated, relation being the specific act of relation, moments of relation that might appear in the piece. And the other important thing about Chaujois especially is the legacy that he has nowadays. Nowadays for Canarian cartoons especially, and for Canarian comics, he's become somewhat this iconic grandfather figure who is now referred to reverently by this Asociación Se Nos Fue el Baifo, who are the Canarian Humorous Association, along with a couple of others, and has sort of become this memorialized character, with Eduardo himself quietly fading away into the background.
It's just a comment. I don't know if you know David Cancel. I know that you, Jorge, know him. He's, I think he's alive still, but I'm not sure. He's one of the first and foremost comics scholar in the United States. And I was just going to say that I met him in Los Angeles many, many years ago. And he told me that it happened to him exactly the same thing when he was in Spain. He went to Plaza de España in Madrid and he started doing yoga. And Guardia Civil came and said, do you know that you can't do these here? And he said, well, I'm American. This was before the Summer of Love. And he was not arrested just because he was American. He used to just, please stop doing that.
And it's that notion that we were talking about earlier of those particular traumas, and in many senses, that's almost what's happening here. It's what's being documented here, and it's a certain relief that's being given to it by depicting that moment, because obviously the absent figure, the Canarian, is very conscious of the fact that this keeps happening. So yeah, it's definitely.
I was just going to say that maybe some other layer of meaning to this image is that, well, apart from ridiculizing the foreigner, is that if a Spanish person did that, he would be put into jail. But okay, if you're English, doesn't matter very much because you're not dangerous. You're not.
I mean, in this context, in the Canaries, especially, for example, the notion of being in the street, with Carnavales quite literally being de facto banned, despite the winter festival which then followed, that notion of assembly in the street again was heavily controlled, especially in Las Palmas de Gran Canaria, especially in Tenerife and in La Laguna and Santa Cruz. So yeah, it definitely feeds into those experiences quite literally, even if it is obviously a bit of a ridiculous scene.
Claro.
Sí. No sé si conocéis respecto a la viñeta a Mary Nash. Es una investigadora que ha trabajado, es una investigadora irlandesa que ha trabajado mucho tiempo en sociología en España, sigue todavía en activo esta señora, y ella, su línea de trabajo principal es precisamente los intercambios en las zonas de costa, como durante el franquismo, además que tiene todo su trabajo sobre esto, como durante el franquismo, cuando se abren los polos del turismo, en ciertos lugares,
Esto es el sur
y
de
empiezan
España.
a venir las suecas,
Sí.
como el arquetipo de la sueca se establece, y también el del Don Juan español, que es el señor cerrado que tenía su mujer tal, pero esos primeros intercambios sexuales también en las zonas de costa, cómo van abriendo en un principio la mentalidad todavía en época franquista, ¿no? Este tipo de intercambios
Sí, claro.
que tienen mucho que ver con la creación de zonas en estos puntos de turismo que son zonas francas para la sexualidad que no existía en ninguna otra parte de España. Entonces, chocaba mucho en los pequeños pueblos donde se abrió el turismo, pero se convirtieron en núcleos de ese tipo de libertad que empieza con la sexualidad. Y me ha parecido, si no la conocíais, importante porque tiene mucho trabajo sobre esto.
¿Y eso es en los años 60?
Merinas, claro, en los años 60, cuando Franco abre los polos turísticos, enseguida se crea el mito de la sueca, porque claro, las suecas venían y le encantaban los españoles, pero para un ratito, 2 o 3 intercambios. Entonces se marchaban. Y se va creando toda una cultura sexual, de hecho eso todavía continúa, la Costa del Sol, eso es histórico, para nosotros es normal. Esta tradición sobre esos intercambios, que fue un choque cultural total. Y fue, digamos, la primera permeabilización que hubo respecto a otras culturas en los puntos de costa, los puntos de los polos turísticos, creados por Franco en los años 60. Merinas se llama la señora, y a raíz de ahí ya sacáis el hilo de todo, porque está muy estudiado y además muy bien.
Pues
después ha habido más estudios.
Just was thinking about when I was reading your presentation, which is very good. If you've read Todo Bajo el Sol by Ana Peñas, it's quite recent. But what is interesting, I mean, it's in Valencia, but it's how she uses collage.
Yeah.
And she takes documents and leaflets from the 1960s when all of this touristic boom starts. And very interesting how Spain tried to present itself to the tourists. And also just, I'm sorry, I don't want to be self-referential here, but I will be self-referential here. But anyway, because I just happened, this was in 2007, I was in Sitges, this beach resort in Catalonia, and which is also known for being kind of a gay resort. Well, it's not exclusively gay, but it has a very gay presence, especially from the UK and Germany. And I remember being kind of baffled by this sign that says something, I can't remember exactly, but in Sitges we dress like this, or you should be dressed like this. And it was pointing directly to that kind of figure, like this kind of big, fat UK tourist who was shirtless. And that was disgusting for the people. I mean, uncivilized in a way. And it just caught my attention. And now, many years after that, now I get it why. So it's interesting to also see how this, at some places, remain strangely conservative, but while at the same time being supposedly a very open place, a very friendly place.
And I mean, this is probably why, dare I say this, as I said, the Giri is a useful figure here, using the Giri as in the regional slang term. The reason he's a very useful figure to depict is because, it's very permissible to, be perceived to have a go at it. It's very, very permissible. It's very normal. If anything, it's reifying conservative ideas, no? Until you start to read into it, suddenly realize that this is a Canarian possibly being a bit subversive. So it plays on that sort of double. And I think you get a lot of this during the process of what we would call apertura. And I think there's a lot more study to be done on apertura, on how it functioned, on especially the sort of clever subversive back and forth that you got within that period, which may have laid a lot of groundworks for what transition became in Spain potentially. There's much more work to be done, especially on comics in this period, which were this growing form, this changing form.
I look at this, I look at the representation of the tourists, and you could have said exactly the same dialogue in Cuba after Cuba was open to tourists, and that would be a tourist from Spain, right? That they will go there and be treated like you can do whatever you want because you're not from here. And also, it started this kind of so there's the sexual myth is la mulata, right? The mestizo between the Spanish conquistador and the African woman slave. And in Cuba, in those years, it brought back all kinds of readings about that, because the stereotype was that Spanish was coming to Cuba for cheap sex, and they favor Black women. So, and the interesting thing is, pretty much, if you were not Cuban, you could do whatever you wanted. And simply the police and everybody would look the other side. However, if you were Cuban, you would be punished. So I look at that and say, wow, it's pretty much look like,
that's
you know,
perhaps
from Cuba.
Perhaps not so surprising, because I'm pretty sure this group of Canarians did at one point actually exhibit in La Habana. And I can't remember the year of the exhibition, but I'm pretty certain they were involved. I mean, yes, the links are there, especially with the Atlantic and Canarians and Cubans going back and forth. I think the Canarian independence movement was started in Cuba rather than the other way around. So there's probably a lot more interchange there than might be said. It's something
my grandparents came from the Canary Islands, so you know, it's
just following to the addition of the bibliography. If Mary Nash did that work, the continuation will be with Eugenia Afineguenova. So they've done a lot of work on tourism. So that's a lot, and Justin Cromba as well. So there's lots of work about that apertura moment with tourism. I'll pass you that.
Yeah, just a brief comment. Tanya, you read my mind. Yeah, when I was looking at this and I was listening to you, Rodri, I thought, gosh, this could perfectly happen in Cuba in the 1940s and 50s, and in post 1991. So with the opening up to tourism. So during Batista's time, and then after 1991. So tourists, Americans could do whatever, you know, Cubans couldn't do it.
Yeah, that's the difference. That before 1959, this would be an American.
That's it. But it will be a Spaniard. It will be a Spaniard or a Canadian. Yeah. But then, but that leads as well to one of the concepts which I really like about your paper, and that is thinking Icelandic or archipelagically. I mean, how to unpack that, how to really make sense of that, you know, in the tradition of Spanish comics, what is different about those comics being produced in the Canary Islands in relation to what is being produced in Spain? And in that sense, I mean, you're using certain concepts which relate to the Caribbean, such as glissando, you know, relación, and which obviously they are very fitting in this case. But because of what Tanya was saying, that the Canary Islands have a really, really strong connection with Cuba, you know, lots of Canarians, you know, went to Cuba, you know, also Catalans as well, but mostly, you know, from the Canary Islands, maybe there's something there to use as well. And I was thinking maybe that this example, you know, connects to many other examples we had in mind happening in Cuba, and maybe another concept used by another scholar, Benitez Rojo.
Repeating islands.
That's it, the differential repetition. I mean, the repeating islands. So this image has been repeated for I don't know how many times in Cuban cultural context, but it's different. But there's something in common. So this differential repetition is maybe something that you could expand and connect, because actually taking into account that the Canary Islands and Cuba are so connected, and that the concept connects as well with relación and glissando in the Caribbean. But yeah, maybe the Canary Islands, you know, have a lot more in common with Cuba than with Spain in many regards. Yeah. So
I mean, I don't think most Canarians would necessarily inherently disagree with you. That's a very politically contentious statement, but I think it's one that certainly probably still stands. It's a very interesting thing to locate, especially these like sort of Islamic regions. The reason I use the term Islamic is because it does imply that slightly broader of the term archipelagic in the same way. It implies the network that these islands are located with, the network that Spain exists. I mean, I don't want to cut Spain out of the picture and pretend the Iberian Peninsula exists. So, you know, I think all of these are linked up in many ways.
Okay, sorry, I have to talk again. Okay, so now we're going to go to the last presentation. So Rodri Schwelbeck, you're going to be presenting the work by E.C. Hollingdale, Cuerda de Presas, a multidirectional examination of women's prisons under Franco. 5 minutes.
Sorry, I will keep this a lot sweet and short, because the thing I basically say about this paper is that I really liked it. I think it's got a lot of really redeeming and interesting analysis, especially. The paper focuses on Presos, which is a collection of 11 short stories by Jorge Garcia and Fidel Martinez. The piece was published, as Martinez stated in an interview with Telesfera in about 2005, to recuperar ese pedazo de la historia en que en cierta medida nos había sido arrebatado. It's more or less, in my view, looking at the notion of memory. I think Izzy handles very carefully a very difficult concept to work with when we're talking about memory. It begins by introducing this sort of novel frame of analysis that the author is trying to offer, which is using Rothberg's and Michael Rothberg's notion of multi-directional memory. This notion has drawn attention from other critics. So, for example, I'd highlight the work of Brian Cameron and Rhiannon McGlade at Cambridge, who've already sort of noted the potential offered by multi-directional memory when applied to the analysis of what they call visual print media, a term that I'm sort of endeared to, if you might notice, in order to analyze what they call dynamic transfers between, for example, the transition and the financial crisis in their context. The employment of the frame of analysis is redeeming, though in my view could even be taken further than Izzy does in this piece. The brief literature review at the start is very satisfying. It introduces the concept of the work, the context of the work, which the author convincingly establishes seems to carry the important function of being able to tell new generations in Spain about the truth and the horrors of Francoism. It also sort of establishes context around the 2005 memory boom, introducing the Asociación de Recuperación de la Memoria Histórica. And the author suggests that the function of memory studies in Spain, and the reason we should study this, we can perhaps look more generally and consider further the notion of memory and how we work with it, is to achieve memory and truth and justice for the victims in order to move past the clutches of Franco. She states that the transition of memories and traumatic stories in Cuerda de Presos is crucial in any format until memory, truth, and justice are recognized by the government. So this certainly, and I would argue rather emphatically, sets out the heavily ethically, politically loaded context in which we find this work and which it's located, and sort of the context for its publication. So following this introduction, the author then moves on to what I think is the most revealing part of the piece, which is looking at two key themes: violence and reproductive control in Cuerda de Presos. And the analyses here, I would argue, are pretty strong. They highlight depictions and links between events within the settings of prisons and then the realities of the regime, and sort of highlight how actually Cuerda de Presos isn't just about capturing these moments. It's about capturing a broader trauma. And I think that's what comes through very well. The author establishes how allusion to violent acts not only as a signpost to the violence that Franco's prisons incited, but also, when we apply a multi-directional memory lens to the story, as a means of reminding the reader of widespread sexual violence, for instance, after the increased after the war, or similarly, that given the widespread knowledge of the issue of separating families, Vincenz's story works not only in highlighting this crime in prisons, but also beyond the prison's walls and into the everyday lives of Spanish people, akin to the oppression of the regime itself. The conclusion of the piece is still very much in development, and I think there's significant outcomes that can come from it, building off the back of the analyses already sort of followed through it. I think it shows a lot of promise, and it demonstrates how specific contexts may actually contain sort of multi-directional realities in the case of representing Spanish history and how we think about representing Spanish history, especially through the graphic novel, through the cartoon. Questions I would pose where it could go further. First, I've got the question quite generally, which I think sort of underlies a lot of what we've been discussing today, which is what's the benefit of the visual in terms of conceptualizing or generating what I would call an affective response, which might further reflection upon memory. So that's to say why the visual can possibly take this a step further in inciting readers to think about memory or to reconsider what memory might constitute. I'd equally inquire as to whether these pieces generate a form of counter-memory in any format, to use the term from Rothberg. And then also, sort of, does it mobilize other forms that challenge hegemonic understandings, especially surrounding, for example, perceptions of violence in contemporary society or in the societies of the past? So I would also possibly more broadly indicate that, for example, something like examining the notions of violence and vulnerability here might be relevant as per sort of the frameworks used by Judith Butler, for instance. And the question I would ultimately have as an outcome, which could be a potential fruitful conclusion, is how might visual depictions of violence and vulnerability in this piece intersect with the realities of generating memory and perhaps more importantly, resistance? So overall, I'd argue this piece provides a satisfying analysis. It employs a multiple directional framework, which to an end is able to tear out a lot of information, a lot of insight around depictions of violence and control in the comic setting, and might incite reflection upon the realities for those who did live in Francoist Spain, as well as us in the present day.
30 seconds.
Nonetheless, I think we can go even further, and I'd like to sort of therefore use it, and I think Izzy can use it, as a jump point from which we can ask questions about how comics memorialize, and perhaps to incite reflection which could weigh upon what generational cultural memory is in the case of the comic. And especially when applying that to rough book framework, I think we get some very interesting potential outcomes.
Yeah, thank you. I really agree with, I think when I was sort of rereading my piece and sort of remind myself, I did pick out as like, having read everyone else's text as well, I was like, I really should have mentioned a bit more about, well, what is the benefit of this medium anyway? I think that was something that I also kind of felt was lacking and should have been, I thought that would have really helped it. But yeah, I think the multi-directional memory in it was a really useful tool, because I kind of saw when I thought it's situated in a prison, and that kind of almost distances it because it's a site, it's literally walled in, and I felt like that makes it more digestible almost, because it others it from the rest of society because it's in these walls. And I don't know if the prisons still exist as buildings, but they're not Francoist prisons now. So I thought that was kind of quite useful. I thought when you apply the multi-directional lens, it kind of helps to draw out, as you kind of highlighted, like it draws out these other instances of violence that were replicated outside the prison walls. And so that was kind of why I went with the multi-directional lens, because I felt like it really helped sort of see how it's actually, okay, it's within these walls in the text, but it's beyond that, and it's a way of memorializing not just the prison and the experience of prisons, which probably has more kind of awareness. But I think when you look at things that maybe haven't been investigated as much, it helps. I think it's really useful to use this lens to kind of explore how it was replicated beyond, and how it's something that also needs attention. Things like sexual violence that might not have had the attention they deserve as of yet. So yeah, that was what really stood out to me and why I decided to put that lens on it. But yeah, and I really like the comments, and yeah, using how can the comics memorialize. I think that's something I really need to add in, is kind of the benefit of the visual and how that works as a memory medium and a way of transferring memory.
Thank you very much. If someone wants to, it's a hard topic to talk about, but
yes, I mean, I can follow up with that. Yeah, really interesting paper, Izzy. And I know your work because you have been working on violence against women and on the stolen babies in Spain for quite some time. So you know that topic, that area. You have been working on that, particularly on literature and a bit on documentaries. And I know that using a comic was venturing on other kind of cultural production. So I'm really, really keen to ask you, because you have worked on this, could you reflect, could you throw some ideas about how what this adds to the existing research you have conducted on Spain on this same topic? What are the differences, what the comics add to what you have already researched? I mean, what those visual components in a comic, those striking visual metaphors that you use, some panels that you use in your paper about the cuarto bajo de la escalera, and those shadows that, you know, in a way they are precluding what is going to happen, you know, the horrors of being being abused, right, in a prison. I mean, what the comic is adding to what you have already researched on this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially when we talk about like the shadows and things, that kind of reminded me a bit of, I did a piece on Madres Paralela, the Almodovar film, which is where the references come. So, and I felt like, yeah, so I think the visual, I think kind of the comics definitely added to what the like kind of the text I've already handled with, because it adds that visual in, which, yeah, I think it really helped me with sort of when there's like that panel with just the 3 sets of eyes. I found that really quite striking, and it really transfers the tension quite cleverly, as this one's about to name the baby a different name. So I felt like that really, I think it really showed me the benefits of adding that visual context into the text that I'm choosing. So yeah, I think that's kind of my reflection. It was really different, and it really did add to what I already have looked at. Because I think I think particularly having that visual in, and it makes it more kind of attractive almost and appealing to have a visual image, and it's also more accessible because you don't need, especially kind of talking about what I've been reading in Paola's text, like you don't always need to know the language as well, but you can kind of understand through the images. So I think it's good for kind of making a broader like transmission of those stories as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed working with it as an addition to what I've been working with this year as well.
Is there any other comment or question?
I just wanted to ask, so besides these 2 works, have you looked at other productions? I know that Anya Peñas's work has already been mentioned, but Todas Estamos Bien, and have you found more samples or?
Not really yet. So I kind of focused in on this. Oh, sorry. Focused in on this particular one, because yeah, like I think it kind of is a new genre to me as well. So, but it was really, I did really enjoy. I found it very accessible and really enjoyable to work with. So it's something I'd want to explore more in the future. I haven't really got like too many backed up now, but I think that would be really interesting to add to.
I also started seeing actually historical graphic novels of the Spanish Civil War, right? So the one that just came about, the story of the anarchist, for example, has the story of Federica Montseny, for instance. So there's a historical narrating of sort of the Spanish Civil War through graphic novels, and then sort of these more personal, sort of reflective. So it would be interesting to sort of, if you're working with comics, it'd be interesting to see those 2 types of interventions.
Yeah, I think definitely that would be really interesting. Yeah, I know a couple of other ones, but not really too many. So I think it would add another like really interesting strand to have that personal, but yeah, in that transmission as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so I enjoyed this paper too. Thanks for this. And I think we're finding that one of the ideas that we keep coming back to in the paper is the multi-directionality. It feels like that's something you're really excited about too. I was going to suggest that Roland Barthes has this bit where he talks about photographs. Well, he has many bits where he talks about photographs, but he talks about photographs and captions together. And he says that that photographs have infinite possible meanings. And if you know Roland Barthes, that's what he's always going for, is more meaning, more meaning, more meaning. And it really, you sense that when somebody puts a caption with a picture, that irritates him because captions narrow the possible meanings. And I'm wondering if, as you continue to develop this multi-directionality thing, maybe there's something in Roland Barthes for you, because again, for him, the image would have infinite meanings. It would be interesting to see if that's true in your comics. If there's greater multi-directionality in the images, and if the dialogue limits that in interesting ways, if the captions limit it in ways that are different from how the dialogue does, for example. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think the multi-directionality thing is working really well, and it might be that Bart would give you some interesting directions to go. Though in my experience, the best way to deal with Bart is to be like, these great big grand gestures are mainly good. But if we drill down, we find some interesting exceptions that start to provide some complexity. So that might be a place to take this further.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that would be really interesting because, yeah, obviously, as you mentioned with the captions, and I think it is such a, yeah, that is very, I don't know much about him, but it's very complex. So, yeah, but I think that would really add to it from what you've said as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I guess we can close the session. Thank you very much to all of you for sharing for this time to show that comics are also a serious thing. So thank you very much.